A late evening on a bustling college campus, where a group of students gathers around a wooden table in the local cafe. The fluorescent lights hum softly above them, the aroma of fresh espresso lingers in the air, and each person's face is illuminated by the glow of a single table lamp. Books are strewn across the table, some well-worn, others brand new, their spines eager to be cracked open. A mild debate has been building. Do we have free will? Are we, as human beings, genuinely free agents capable of making choices unbound by fate, biology, or the movement of atoms? Or is the entire notion of free will simply a comforting illusion, carefully constructed by our brains? This conversation was sparked by an assigned reading from Sam Harris's Free Will in a philosophy seminar. Harris, a neuroscientist and philosopher, famously argues that free will is more or less an illusion. He claims that when we peer under the hood of our thoughts, they simply arise in the mind without any sense of conscious authorship. One student, Lucy, is quite shaken by this. She wonders, if my thoughts arise without my control, then what does that mean for my sense of self? Are all my decisions predetermined by my biology and environment? Meanwhile, across the table, Devin flips through Daniel Dennett's Elbow Room, the varieties of free will worth wanting. Dennett, a well-known philosopher, takes a compatibilist view. He asserts that even if the universe is governed by deterministic physical laws, we can still carve out a sense of freedom that matters for moral responsibility and human flourishing. Devin finds Dennett's approach comforting. After all, if free will in the ultimate sense, totally uncaused choices, isn't achievable, at least the type of freedom worth having is still possible within a deterministic universe. At the back of the cafe, practically hidden by the shadows, sits a retired professor named Dr. Ortega. She taught philosophy for decades and has read widely, from Plato's dialogues discussing responsibility and virtue to David Hume's naturalistic approach, all the way to Robert Kaine's The Significance of Free Will, which defends a libertarian notion of freedom. Dr. Ortega sips her tea quietly, watching the young philosophers passionately exchange ideas. She remembers the fiery debates of her college days and the many times she taught these very arguments. She knows that every generation comes to these questions anew, with fresh eyes, ready to challenge centuries of accumulated wisdom. A hush falls as Lucy turns to Dr. Ortega. "Professor," she asks quietly, "do you think our choices are our own?" The question feels heavy, as though it echoes with the voices of countless philosophers from the past. Aristotle, who famously wrote on virtue and moral responsibility; Thomas Aquinas, who tried to reconcile free will with God's omniscience; and Immanuel Kant, who believed moral law depends on our autonomy. Dr. Ortega sets down her tea and offers a gentle smile. "This question," she begins, "has puzzled philosophers, theologians, scientists, and everyday people for thousands of years. Understanding free will isn't just some esoteric exercise. It goes to the very heart of our humanity. Whether we can be praised or blamed for our actions, whether we can shape our destinies, and whether we have the power to create meaning in our lives." In this script, we'll journey from that bustling cafe into the broad landscape of free will debates. We'll introduce key terms, explore major philosophical positions, dig into the neuroscience research that challenges our intuitive sense of freedom, and see how different thinkers have tried to make sense of moral responsibility in a world that might be determined by prior events. But before we dive deep, keep in mind that there is also room for a story in philosophy. The narrative is one of the best ways to illustrate the impact of abstract concepts on concrete human lives. So get comfortable, imagine the chatter of that cafe, and step into the conversation. Together we'll traverse centuries of thought, meet philosophers ancient and modern, and return with a clearer understanding of the philosophical tapestry that is free will. To understand why people get so worked up about free will, let's consider a short fable. Once, in a quiet village nestled between two great mountains, there lived a young tailor named Milo. Milo was known throughout the village for his beautiful, intricate embroidery. One day, a wealthy traveller commissioned him to craft a breathtaking cloak with golden thread. Milo spent weeks meticulously stitching every detail. When the time came to deliver the cloak, a terrible storm rolled in and a bolt of lightning struck Milo's workshop, destroying his masterpiece. Devastated, Milo questioned the forces that led to this catastrophe. Was it my destiny that this cloak was doomed? Or was I simply unlucky? Did any of my choices matter at all? Milo's cry resonates with all of us. We want our choices to matter. We invest energy, passion, and time in our actions, hoping our free will shapes our destinies. But if everything that happens is predetermined by a chain of cause and effect that started long before our birth, are we truly free? Moral responsibility. One of the biggest stakes in the free will debate is the concept of moral responsibility. Our legal and ethical systems largely rest on the assumption that individuals are responsible for their actions. If you intentionally harm someone, we think you should be held accountable. But if your actions are entirely determined by your genetic makeup, your upbringing, and the environment, factors you didn't choose, how fair is it to punish you? Could we still justify blame, praise, reward, or punishment? Think of how courts grapple with the insanity defense, wherein a person's mental state might reduce their culpability. Our entire notion of justice hinges on an underlying belief. People can make genuine choices and be evaluated for them, agency and meaning. Then there's the existential dimension. Does life have meaning if our choices aren't freely made? For centuries, philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre have argued that our ability to choose is what gives life authenticity and personal responsibility. Existence precedes essence, Sartre declared, meaning we define ourselves through our choices. But if neuroscience or physics suggests our choices are illusions, some worry that existence might lose its grandeur, that we become mere spectators, watching events unfold. Others, however, argue that acknowledging determinism can lead to greater compassion and understanding, since we might realize how much each person is shaped by their circumstances. Personal growth. On a more personal level, we want to believe in free will because it underpins our sense of self-improvement. If I want to learn a new language, be kinder, or change a harmful habit, I believe I have the power to take the first step. That belief in the power to choose can be deeply motivating. Alternatively, if someone believed wholeheartedly that free will does not exist, they might fall into a state of helplessness, though ironically, choosing to adopt that attitude also becomes complicated in a deterministic framework. Philosophy and everyday life. While the free will debate might sound lofty and academic, it permeates our daily lives. Consider any moment you made a big decision, choosing a career path, deciding whether to commit to a relationship, or even picking what to eat for dinner. Did you feel like you had options, or did your taste buds, your cultural upbringing, your financial constraints, and your immediate desires funnel you into one inevitable choice? We all live with an ingrained feeling that we are free to decide. The tension arises when we try to reconcile that feeling with scientific explanations of human behavior. So, free will matters because it influences how we see ourselves, how we judge others, how we shape society, and how we find meaning in life. Whether or not it's an illusion, it's a powerful concept with real-world consequences. As Dr. Ortega might say, free will is not just an academic puzzle. It's a mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting our deepest hopes, fears, and values. Philosophy thrives on clarity of definitions. When we say free will, what exactly do we mean? The problem is that free will is a slippery phrase. Different philosophers use it differently, and ordinary language often doesn't help. However, we can start by breaking down a few key ideas. Determinism. This is the view that every event in the universe, including every human action, is the consequence of prior events combined with the laws of nature. If you could rewind the universe to a prior state, it would unfold the same way, no ifs, ands, or buts. Think of dominoes lined up. Once the first falls, the rest fall in a predictable chain reaction. In a deterministic world, everything, from a star going supernova to your choice of lunch today, was theoretically fixed by the state of the universe at a previous time, in determinism. The opposite stance suggests that not everything is determined. Some events could occur randomly or probabilistically, especially when considering quantum mechanics. However, even if quantum events introduce randomness, that doesn't necessarily guarantee free will in the sense of conscious control. Randomness might mean unpredictability, But unpredictability isn't the same as free choice. For instance, if a dice roll or a quantum fluctuation decides your next thought, that still doesn't sound like the free will most people intuitively cherish. 3. Free will, broadly conceived. We tend to assume that to have free will means we could have done otherwise under the same circumstances. If you chose chocolate ice cream, you could have chosen vanilla given all the same physical and mental conditions. Another notion of free will is having conscious control or authorship over decisions. Both definitions raise huge questions about the causal chain leading to those decisions, the tension. So the big philosophical question is, can free will exist in a deterministic universe? If determinism is true, it seems like all events, including our decisions, are fixed by prior causes. But if indeterminism is true, we might just be subject to randomness. Neither scenario comfortably fits the idea that I choose in a meaningful, responsible way. This tension forms the backbone of debates between hard determinists, compatibilists, and libertarians, in the metaphysical sense, not the political. Hard determinism. Proponents say free will is incompatible with determinism, and determinism is true. So free will doesn't exist. Moral responsibility becomes questionable or is reframed in entirely different terms. Libertarian free will. Not to be confused with political libertarians, these philosophers believe free will exists and is incompatible with determinism, so determinism must be false. They often posit some special non-physical or emergent aspect of the mind that allows for genuine free choice. Compatibilism. These philosophers argue that free will and determinism can coexist. Even if our actions are determined by prior causes, we can still call them free in a sense that preserves moral responsibility. This redefinition typically hinges on distinctions like voluntary versus involuntary actions, internal versus external constraints, and so on. A personal reflection. Let's return to our cafe. Devin, who's immersed in Dennett's elbow room, finds solace in the compatibilist view. He says, "Look, maybe everything's determined, but I still experience choices. As long as I'm not coerced or compelled by external forces, like someone holding a gun to my head, then I'm acting freely. Isn't that the kind of free will we care about?" Lucy, on the other hand, is worried about being a puppet of her biology and upbringing. She isn't satisfied with just feeling free. She wants to know that she actually could have chosen differently in the same scenario. Dr. Ortega, smiling, recounts the words of the 18th century philosopher David Hume, who said that our idea of liberty, free will, is compatible with necessity, determinism. For Hume, free will is simply the power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will, which is consistent with the idea that these determinations are themselves caused. This conceptual maneuver has shaped much of compatibilist thinking ever since. Yet the tension remains. No matter how philosophers define free will, the question lingers, is our sense of I can do otherwise a genuine reflection of reality, or is it a user-friendly interface slapped onto a deterministic or random process in the brain? The cafe debate intensifies as Lucy and Devin prepare to explore historical perspectives next, hoping that a tour through the ages will shed light on their modern conundrum, ancient Greece to medieval theology. One of the earliest discussions about free will emerged from the Stoics in ancient Greece. The Stoics believed in a kind of natural order or fate that governed the cosmos. They argued that while external events are determined by fate, humans still have the capacity for rational judgment and virtue. The historian Alexander of Aphrodisias, 2nd–3rd century CE, sometimes called the commentator on Aristotle, defended an early form of libertarian free will, suggesting that we have genuine control over our moral character. Aristotle himself introduced the concept of voluntary and involuntary actions in his Nicomachean Ethics, paving the way for debates on moral responsibility. With the rise of Christianity, the question of free will became intertwined with theology. Augustine of Hippo wrestled with reconciling human free will and divine foreknowledge. If God knows everything that will happen, past, present, and future, how can we truly be free to choose otherwise? Augustine concluded that human free will and divine foreknowledge can coexist, even if it's not fully comprehensible to finite minds. Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, integrated Aristotelian thought with Christian doctrine, emphasizing that God's omniscience doesn't negate human free will, because God exists outside of time, and thus sees all times simultaneously rather than determining them. Early modern thinkers. Jumping ahead to the Enlightenment, René Descartes, 17th century, introduced a strong sense of dualism between mind and body. He believed the mind, a non-physical substance, had a freedom that mere physical matter lacked. Yet as science advanced, the notion of a strictly deterministic mechanical universe gained traction. Baruch Spinoza argued that everything unfolds from the necessity of God's nature, and that our sense of freedom arises from ignorance of the causes that move us. David Hume offered a proto-compatibilist stance. He saw the idea of necessity, or determinism, as a pattern of cause and effect we observe in nature, but he did not see it as conflicting with our ability to act according to our will. He famously wrote that liberty is the power of acting or not acting, according to the determinations of the will, and believed that moral responsibility is grounded in our character and passions, all of which arise naturally. Immanuel Kant took a more complicated approach. He argued that in the realm of phenomena, the world as it appears to us, everything is determined by cause and effect. However, in the noumenal realm, the thing in itself which lies beyond our sensory experience, we might have freedom. For Kant, moral law makes sense only if we are autonomous. Hence, he posited that moral agency presupposes free will, even if science can't confirm it empirically. 19th to early 20th century, with the advent of Darwin's theory of evolution and the growth of psychology, the deterministic viewpoint grew stronger. Arthur Schopenhauer famously quipped, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." He suggested that while we can choose our actions, we cannot choose the underlying desires that give rise to them. Friedrich Nietzsche, on the other hand, saw traditional concepts of free will as tied up with moral systems designed to encourage guilt and obedience. He called for a re-evaluation of values, prompting many later philosophers to question the very basis of moral responsibility tied to free will. By the early 20th century, thinkers like Sigmund Freud argued that much of our mental life is unconscious and shaped by childhood experiences, further challenging the idea that we are the fully aware authors of our actions. Meanwhile, the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre in particular defended radical freedom, insisting we are condemned to be free and wholly responsible for everything we make of ourselves, bringing us to now. This rich tapestry of thought sets the stage for contemporary debates. Whether it's the theological puzzle of divine foreknowledge, the existential assertion of radical freedom, or the scientific push toward determinism, each era has found itself wrestling with a perennial paradox. For Lucien Devon in the Café, these historical voices feel distant yet oddly relevant. After all, the human condition hasn't fundamentally changed. We still wonder if our choices are truly ours, or if we're just actors reciting lines from a cosmic script. Dr. Ortega closes her eyes for a moment, remembering how each philosopher contributed a thread to the tapestry. Perhaps, she thinks, the answers lie not in discarding one viewpoint, but in understanding how each perspective illuminates a facet of this great mystery. The next step in our journey is to look more closely at the modern debates. Hard determinism, compatibilism, and libertarianism, each championed by contemporary voices who bring fresh arguments and scientific insights into the fray. If all events have causes stretching back to the dawn of time, then it's hard to see how our wills could be free in any ultimate sense. This line of thinking leads to hard determinism, the position that free will is simply incompatible with determinism, and determinism is true. Hence, free will is an illusion. Sam Harris is perhaps the most famous contemporary proponent of this perspective for a popular audience. In his book Free Will, Harris draws from neuroscience to argue that our thoughts and decisions arise from processes in the brain that we do not control. For example, we don't decide which thoughts pop into our heads, they just appear. Furthermore, physiological studies, like the famous Benjamin Libet experiments, show that neural activity corresponding to a decision can be detected a fraction of a second before we become consciously aware of having made that decision. In other words, by the time we consciously decide, our brain has already launched the process. From the hard determinist standpoint, everything about you, your genetics, your upbringing, your environment, conspires to produce each moment of your life. If you grew up in a loving home, you might be predisposed to kindness. If you grew up in hardship, your behavior might reflect coping mechanisms shaped by trauma. You didn't choose your genes or your childhood circumstances, and yet these factors heavily influence your adult life. Moral consequences? Hard determinists face the tricky question of moral responsibility. If nobody can genuinely do otherwise, how do we judge people's actions? Harris proposes that we can still detain criminals for the protection of society. but we might adopt a more compassionate stance, seeing evil actions more like diseases to be treated than sins to be punished. After all, if everything is determined, an individual's actions, even the most horrific, follow inevitably from a chain of cause and effect. This doesn't mean letting harmful people roam free. Rather, it shifts our perspective from retribution to prevention and rehabilitation. I feel free though. A common objection to hard determinism is our strong introspective sense of freedom. How could something that feels so real be an illusion? Hard determinists reply that plenty of illusions feel real. Optical illusions, for instance, can be almost impossible to unsee, even when we know they're tricking us. Just because we feel free doesn't mean we are free. Humans evolved to survive in complex social environments, and believing ourselves to be autonomous agents could be evolutionarily advantageous, even if it's not factually accurate. In the cafe debate, Lucy tries to process what it would mean for her sense of agency to be an illusion. She imagines her future self confronted with challenging decisions and wonders if it's all scripted. Would she lose motivation if she became a hard determinist? Or, ironically, is that feeling of losing motivation itself already determined by her brain state? A moment of story. Dr. Ortega recalls a moment early in her career when she watched a documentary on the psychological development of child soldiers in war-torn countries. The children were coerced, traumatized, and systematically indoctrinated to commit atrocities. Later, some of them genuinely repented, while others continued on dark paths. If one fully embraced hard determinism, could we blame these children-turned adults for actions shaped by horrendous environments? Or would we see them as tragic figures set on a path not of their choosing? Her reflections echo Harris's approach, suggesting that a thoroughly hard determinist worldview fosters empathy because it acknowledges that all behaviour arises from conditions we didn't choose, genes, environment, and chance. However, it also raises disquieting questions about personal achievement, love, and creativity. If everything is predetermined, is there room for genuine innovation or self-expression? Despite these troubling questions, hard determinists remain steadfast. They argue that while giving up the notion of ultimate free will can be jarring, it can also open the door to a more rational, compassionate society, one that sees each person as a node in a vast causal network, deserving understanding rather than moralistic condemnation. And with that, Lucy sets down Harris's book, her mind buzzing with questions. The group glances at Devin, who's about to offer a counterpoint from the compatibilist camp. Unlike hard determinists, compatibilists maintain that free will is not only possible, but can thrive even in a fully deterministic universe. Their strategy often involves redefining free will in ways that align with determinism while preserving moral responsibility. Daniel Dennett, in Elbow Room and later in Freedom Evolves, champions this viewpoint. He suggests that the freedom we genuinely care about is the ability to act according to our desires and plans without external coercion, and the ability to reflect on and revise those desires if needed. Under this definition, you're free if you can deliberate, consider alternatives, and act based on reasons. Whether these reasons ultimately trace back to prior causes doesn't undermine the reality of your deliberation. Real-world examples. Suppose you want to learn how to play piano. A compatibilist would say, you can freely choose to practice every day. That choice is influenced by your love of music and your upbringing, sure, but that doesn't negate the authenticity of your goal. The crux is that you're not being forced by external manipulation, like a hypnotist or a physical constraint. Your choice arises from your internal motivations, which is enough to call it free in the sense that matters for personal responsibility and society. Moral responsibility revisited. Compatibilists argue that holding people responsible makes sense if they can respond to reasons. For example, if you say to someone, "Don't steal or you'll be punished," and they understand and can be motivated by that reasoning, they have the sort of agency that justifies praise or blame. Determinism might underlie everything, but as long as someone's actions flow from their character and rational deliberation rather than external compulsion, then we can fairly hold them responsible. Criticisms of compatibilism. Critics call compatibilism a verbal sleight of hand. They argue that compatibilists redefine free will as something that sidesteps the core question. Could I have done otherwise in the same circumstances? If determinism is true, the answer seems to be no. Even if you felt like you could have chosen differently, you wouldn't have, because the past and laws of nature fix the future. Compatibilists often reply that the relevant sense of could have done otherwise is, if you'd wanted to, you could have. That's different from the metaphysical notion of replaying the entire universe from the same initial conditions. Story interlude. Devon shares a personal anecdote. In high school, he struggled to decide whether to join the soccer team or focus on theatre. He ultimately chose theatre, discovering a love for performance. Looking back, he imagines, what if I had gone the sports route? A hard determinist would say that, given the same initial conditions, you'd always pick theatre. A compatibilist would say, yes, but if your desires or reasoning had been different, you could have chosen soccer. That's the sense in which your choice was free. Devon likes the compatibilist position because it preserves the meaningfulness of his decisions and the sense that he's an agent who can learn, grow, and adapt. Even if cosmic determinism is true, he's content with the idea that free will is about making reasoned choices in response to changing information. Daniel Dennett's approach. Dennett famously compares free will to other concepts that are emergent or functional. For instance, the concept of health isn't something you can point to in a single molecule. It emerges from complex interactions in the body. Similarly, free will might not exist at the fundamental particle level, but it emerges in creatures sophisticated enough to reflect on their thinking processes, adopt goals, and coordinate complex behaviours. This approach allows for a naturalised scientific account of free will that retains our everyday distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions. Dr. Ortega nods approvingly. She has always found Dennett's approach intellectually satisfying, though she remembers a time she debated a libertarian philosopher who insisted that Dennett's view, while practical, sidesteps the deep freedom question. Nevertheless, compatibilism remains a dominant position in analytic philosophy today. It attempts to hold on to our intuitions about moral responsibility while embracing a fully naturalistic worldview. With compatibilism on the table, Lucy glances at another book on the table, Robert Caine's The Significance of Free Will, which defends a libertarian perspective. She wonders how someone in the modern age manages to uphold the idea that we can be the ultimate originators of our actions. "Let's find out, Doctor," Ortega says, opening the text. In contrast to compatibilism and hard determinism, libertarian views of free will, in the metaphysical sense, assert two key points. Human beings possess free will that isn't reducible to deterministic or random processes. Determinism is incompatible with this robust, deep freedom. Robert Caine, a prominent defender of libertarian free will, suggests we have self-forming actions, SFAs. These are moments of indeterminacy in our brains where we simultaneously experience competing desires. According to Caine, in these moments, our character is shaped by the choice we make, and this choice isn't determined by prior causes or mere randomness. Instead, it reflects a form of genuine self-determination. The will as originator. Think of yourself at a crossroads. Part of you wants to stay in bed, while part of you wants to get up early and go for a run. Caine argues that in such moments, both options are genuinely possible. The choice you make is not just a coin flip, nor strictly the inevitable outcome of your genetics and history. Instead, your effort will tip the scales. Over time, these self-forming choices accumulate, crafting your moral and personal identity. Because you're the originator of these actions, you're truly responsible. Mind-body or event-causal approaches. Libertarians split on how exactly this free will is instantiated. Some adopt agent-causal theories, proposing that a conscious agent can initiate a new causal chain not predetermined by prior events. Others go for event-causal theories, suggesting that while events in the brain follow causal laws, there's an element of genuine indeterminacy that allows for freedom. Quantum mechanics is sometimes invoked here, but critics say quantum indeterminacy doesn't automatically grant agency. It might just introduce randomness. Critiques of libertarianism. The biggest challenge is explaining how indeterminacy or agent causation doesn't collapse into randomness, or remain a mysterious process outside the scope of scientific understanding. If we say the agent's choice is not determined by prior events, critics ask, then what does determine it? Is it just luck? Another point is the interaction problem. If mind and matter are distinct, how does the immaterial mind cause physical changes in the brain? Some libertarians see consciousness as an emergent property that can have top-down causal influence, but this remains philosophically and scientifically contentious. In our ongoing story, Lucy finds libertarianism appealing because it preserves the meaningful sense that she could have done otherwise in the same situation. She imagines a turning point in her life, the moment she decided to pursue a philosophy degree rather than business. It was a difficult choice, with strong motivations on both sides. If everything had been the same, her thoughts, environment, and past, could she have chosen business? The libertarian says yes, that's the very essence of free will. For Lucy, that resonates deeply with her lived experience. Dr. Ortega, however, points out that critics see this as potentially mystical. If the physical world is governed by laws, then either those laws are deterministic or there's randomness. Where does genuine freedom fit in? Robert Kane's careful philosophical arguments try to show that certain kinds of indeterminism, coupled with rational deliberation and effort of will, might create a space for genuine self-determination. Anecdote of a poet. Dr. Ortega recalls reading about a poet who described her creative process as listening to the words the universe whispered, but deciding which ones to sing back. In a sense, the words that come to her might be random or determined by her prior linguistic influences, but the poet experiences a clear, conscious act of selection. For her, that act is neither forced nor random, but an authentic expression of her true self. Libertarians see this as a beautiful analogy for free will, a dance between what's given and what we consciously choose. Thus, libertarian theories remain vibrant, especially among those who feel that compatibilism sidesteps a more robust notion of freedom. While the scientific plausibility of libertarian free will is often contested, the philosophical intuition behind it, I really can choose otherwise, remains strong for many. And so, as Lucy and Devon set down Kane's book, they realise that the cafe table has grown crowded with conflicting positions, each with its strengths and weaknesses. One of the most significant modern challenges to free will come from neuroscience. Benjamin Libet's pioneering studies in the 1980s discovered that the brain's readiness potential, the build-up of neural activity leading to a simple action like pushing a button, occurred about 350 milliseconds before subjects reported a conscious decision to act. This finding suggested that the brain has already initiated an action before the conscious mind decides to do it. Interpretations of Libet. Some took Libet's experiments as proof that free will is an illusion. Your brain decides, then your mind catches up. Others, including Libet himself, argued that consciousness will still exert a veto power. You could still abort the action after the brain's initial build-up. Subsequent research, like the studies by neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes, used fMRI to predict decisions up to 7 to 10 seconds before people became conscious of them, further fueling the debate, critiques of the experiments. Not everyone believes these experiments decisively refute free will. Critics say that pushing a button in a lab under timed conditions isn't analogous to complex life decisions, like choosing a career or forming a moral conviction. The readiness potential might just reflect the brain's general state of preparedness to act, rather than a specific decision. Moreover, consciousness and brain processes are intimately linked, so it's no surprise that neural activity precedes conscious awareness. This doesn't necessarily eliminate the possibility of free will at the level of reflection, reasoning, and higher-order thought. Neuroscience and responsibility. If neuroscience does show that our decisions are largely unconscious processes bubbling up before we're aware, can we still hold people responsible for crimes or immoral actions? Some philosophers, like Patricia Churchland, advocate for a pragmatic approach. Whether or not free will exist in some ultimate sense, we can still talk meaningfully about degrees of responsibility based on how reason-responsive a person is. The brain's unconscious processes might be the engine, but the conscious mind is part of the feedback loop that shapes future brain states. Personal exploration story. Lucy recalls a moment before the big seminar. She was walking across campus, daydreaming about dinner plans, when she suddenly found herself turning toward the library. It felt spontaneous. She hadn't consciously decided. She wonders, was that just her brain's autopilot? Possibly. But then she remembers times when she weighed options carefully, writing down the pros and cons. Could that reflective process, which took days, also be explained purely by unconscious neural processes? Dr. Ortega weighs in. Part of the confusion arises from how we define consciousness. It's not a single thing, but rather a multi-layered process. The fact that some neural activity starts before conscious awareness doesn't imply your conscious self plays no role. Decision-making might be distributed across different brain networks, with consciousness being the final integration or a monitoring system. Reading Sam Harris and others. Lucy flips back to Harris's free will, noticing his emphasis on how we don't choose our thoughts. To Harris, the Libet experiments are one piece of a larger puzzle, illustrating that the conscious sense of "I am the author" is a post hoc interpretation. However, philosophers like Dennett argue that focusing on milliseconds in a lab oversimplifies the real phenomenon of choice, which often unfolds over extended periods of deliberation. The cafe at sunset. As the sun sets outside, painting the cafe's windows in shades of orange, Dr. Ortega jokes, "Our readiness potentials have probably been firing for hours, prompting us to keep this debate alive." The group laughs, acknowledging the interplay of biological processes and conscious deliberation that brought them to this philosophical cafe table in the first place. Lucy and Devin realise there may be no simple knockout blow from neuroscience, but the evidence does challenge naive assumptions about conscious control, encouraging a more nuanced understanding of how the mind, brain, and environment interact. Free will and moral responsibility. Even if we never fully resolve the metaphysical question of free will, whether it's an illusion compatible with determinism or truly indeterministic, there remains a pragmatic issue: moral responsibility. Societies need to figure out how to praise, blame, punish, and reward behaviour. P.F. Strawson, in his essay Freedom and Resentment, argued that our practices of praising and blaming are rooted in natural human emotions like resentment, gratitude, and forgiveness. These emotional reactions form the basis of moral responsibility, regardless of whether determinism is true. Strawson believed that trying to step outside of these emotional attitudes is neither desirable nor practically possible, because they're part of the interpersonal fabric that makes society function. The legal system. Consider the courtroom. A defendant stands accused of theft. If the judge wholeheartedly believed in hard determinism, would that mean letting the thief go unpunished? Not necessarily. Laws serve not only to assign blame, but also to deter future crimes and protect the public. Under a compatibilist framework, we say the thief had reasons not to steal. It's illegal, immoral, etc., yet stole anyway, so we hold them responsible. Under a hard determinist framework, we might shift the focus from punishment to treatment, or rehabilitation, while still removing them from society if necessary. Under libertarianism, we'd see the thief as the ultimate originator of their actions and thus fully accountable, unless extenuating circumstances diminish that freedom. Public policy and compassion. Sam Harris and other determinists argue that acknowledging the causal influences on behaviour can make us more compassionate. If someone commits a crime, we can look at the factors that led them there: poverty, mental illness, lack of education, and address those problems proactively. Instead of moralistic outrage, we'd shift towards solutions that reduce criminal behaviour by tackling root causes. In the cafe, a thought experiment. Devin raises a thought experiment. Suppose a neurosurgeon implants a device in my brain that makes me crave chocolate uncontrollably at 3 p.m. every day. Am I responsible for eating chocolate then? Most would say no. Devin's craving is artificially introduced. But what if you learned that Devin's natural brain, shaped by genetics and environment, predisposes him to that same craving? Why treat that differently? If we're willing to exonerate him when an external manipulator is at play, what about the manipulations of nature? This question underlines the worry about moral responsibility in a determined or manipulated world. Compatibilists respond that the difference lies in whether Devin can respond to reasons. If the externally controlled craving overrides reason, he's not morally responsible. If it's just a strong urge, but he can still deliberate on whether to give in, then moral responsibility remains intact. Practical underdetermination. In reality, everyday moral judgments rarely rely on deep metaphysical truths. When a friend breaks a promise, we might get angry or disappointed, not because we're certain about the nature of free will, but because we rely on the practical assumption that people can keep or break promises. Philosophers like John Martin Fisher argue that this semi-compatibilist stance is enough for moral responsibility, even if ultimate free will is never resolved. A short story of forgiveness. Dr. Ortega tells of a former student, Jasmine, who discovered that her alcoholic father stole money for liquor. Initially, she felt deep anger and betrayal. But when she learned more about his traumatic childhood and genetic predisposition, her anger turned to compassion. She didn't deny the harm done, but understanding the causal chains changed her emotional response. This didn't mean excusing his behaviour, it meant approaching it with empathy, a desire to help and a clearer boundary for self-protection. That story illustrates that moral responsibility can be balanced with an understanding of causal influences. Whether we adopt a hard determinist or compatibilist view, we can still maintain a moral framework that encourages good behaviour, promotes well-being, and recognises the complexity of human psychology. The group in the cafe lingers on that point, recognising that no matter where they land on the free will spectrum, the implications for how we treat each other remain profound. Shifting gears, we come to the existentialist perspective on free will, famously articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre in works like Being and Nothingness. For Sartre, free will is not a mere theoretical concept, it is the essence of human existence. He posited that humans are condemned to be free, meaning we are thrown into a world without intrinsic values or meanings, and we must choose who we become at every moment. Radical freedom. Sartre's idea of radical freedom can be disquieting. He claimed there's no human nature or moral blueprint to follow. Our actions alone define us. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself, he wrote. This leads to anguish because with no predetermined essence, every choice carries the weight of creating a personal and moral identity. There's no hiding behind excuses of fate or destiny. You're responsible for your life's meaning. Bad faith. Sartre introduced the concept of bad faith to describe self-deception, when we pretend we have no choice, or we're just fulfilling a role society expects of us. An example is a waiter who's overplaying the role of the waiter, adopting cliches of what a waiter is supposed to be, thereby denying his freedom to be otherwise. For Sartre, living authentically means embracing the terror and exhilaration of our freedom. Existential tension with determinism. While existentialists emphasize the subjective experience of freedom, they don't always grapple deeply with the scientific notion of determinism. Critics say existentialism focuses on the phenomenological feel of freedom rather than the causal structure of the universe. Yet existentialists respond that the core truth is how we experience and enact choice. If from the inside we experience ourselves as free, that phenomenological reality is what shapes our lived world. Story of an artist's awakening. Picture an artist named Mara, who spent years in a stifling corporate job, telling herself she had to stay for financial security. One day, she's struck by the realization that this job is a choice. It might be heavily influenced by fears, social expectations, and economic constraints, but it's still a choice. Overwhelmed by anxiety, she quits to pursue painting full-time, confronting the uncertainty of living as an artist. For existentialists, this is a classic moment of awakening. Mara recognizes she's not locked into a predetermined path. Even if she fails, she's responsible for taking that risk, for it is an expression of her freedom. Connection to modern thought. Existential themes resurface in psychology and personal development. Therapists sometimes emphasize personal responsibility, urging clients to see how they interpret and respond to life's challenges as choices. While neuroscience and philosophy raise questions about how free these choices are, many find existential insights empowering on a day-to-day basis. Lucy finds this perspective invigorating, especially as she contemplates her career. Whether or not the universe is determined, the experience of forging one's path feels intensely real. Sartre's viewpoint resonates with her creative spark, encouraging her to make bold choices rather than passively drifting. Meanwhile, Devon wonders if existentialism too quickly dismisses the real constraints of environment, biology, and unconscious processes. Dr. Ortega places a gentle hand on Lucy's shoulder. Existentialism reminds us that philosophical inquiry must return to the human situation, our hopes, fears, and lived experiences. Even if you adopt a compatibilist or hard determinist stance in theory, there's a kernel of truth in Sartre's call to recognize your agency. Whether or not we ultimately have metaphysical free will, existentialism compels us to act as if we do, facing the consequences with courage. It's a philosophical stance that melds personal responsibility with an awareness of the world's inherent uncertainty, inviting us to seize the moment, define our projects, and take ownership of our lives. By now, our cafe table is piled high with philosophical tomes: Sam Harris's Free Will, Daniel Dennett's Elbow Room, Robert Caine's The Significance of Free Will, and existentialist classics like Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Lucy and Devin are awash in ideas, from the possibility that free will is an illusion to the notion that we hold a radical kind of freedom in our hands. A summary of positions: hard determinism, everything is determined, free will is an illusion, embrace empathy and rehabilitation over retribution. Compatibilism, determinism and free will can coexist. Redefine free will in terms of voluntary action and reason responsiveness. Libertarian free will, deep freedom is real and incompatible with determinism. Self-forming actions are the basis of moral responsibility. Existential freedom emphasizes the lived experience of choosing and the weight of creating one's essence, less focused on scientific determinism and more on subjective responsibility. Why no consensus? One reason the free will debate endures is that it touches on multiple domains: ethics, theology, psychology, neuroscience, and everyday experience. Each domain brings its methods of inquiry and standards of proof. Philosophers differ on which domain should take priority. A neuroscientist might trust brain scans over introspective reports, while an existentialist might say introspection is the core reality of choice. A theologian might emphasize divine omniscience, and a moral philosopher might focus on accountability. Pluralism or a single answer? Some modern scholars adopt a pluralistic approach, suggesting that different senses of free will are relevant in different contexts. For instance, the practical sense of making responsible choices is valid for moral and legal frameworks, even if on a fundamental level the universe might be deterministic. Others search for a unified theory that can reconcile these perspectives, though so far no single viewpoint has achieved universal acceptance. Returning to story. The cafe is nearly empty now, the barista's wiping tables as closing time approaches. Lucy and Devin each reflect on the day's discussion, feeling both enlightened and overwhelmed. Dr. Ortega stands to leave, offering one final story. When I was a graduate student, I wrestled with free will for months. I felt paralyzed by the possibility that I wasn't in control of my life. One night, I had a dream. I was on a vast ocean, and the boat beneath me seemed to move on its own. At first I panicked. Was I just a passenger? Then I noticed the sails and the rudder, and realized I could adjust them even if I couldn't control the wind or waves. That dream became my metaphor. Whether the ocean's movements are deterministic or not, my decisions about how to steer still matter to me. In that metaphor, we see a compatibilist flavour, accepting the world's constraints, while cherishing the bits of agency we do have. But one could also see a libertarian reading. Self-forming actions are those bold choices to trim the sails differently. A hard determinist might say the dream was shaped by prior causes, but can still inspire compassion and personal growth. An existentialist might interpret the dream as highlighting the anguish and responsibility we face in forging our paths. Why study free will? Because it challenges us to think deeply about who we are and how we should live. Even if you leave the debate unresolved, you carry insights into human psychology, ethics, and the nature of reality. The free will question beckons us to examine everything from our criminal justice policies to our relationships, and in confronting it, we confront ourselves. The cafe door rattles shut behind Dr. Ortega, leaving Lucy and Devin alone with the lingering aroma of coffee and the quiet hush of the closing hour. The lights overhead grow dim, as if symbolizing the close of a chapter, but not the end of the story. Lucy gathers her books, a gentle smile curving her lips. She feels the weight of new knowledge pressing on her, yet also a sense of wonder. She asks Devin, "So, after everything, do you think we have free will?" Devin laughs, shrugging. "I'm not sure, but I feel more motivated than ever to keep exploring the question. The role of choice in our lives, that's the key takeaway. Whether free will is real or illusory, the perception of choice matters deeply in how we live. On one hand, seeing ourselves as agents with the power to change can foster growth, creativity, and moral responsibility. On the other, acknowledging how much is shaped by forces beyond our control can cultivate empathy, humility, and understanding. Perhaps the best path forward is to integrate these insights, recognizing constraints without erasing the personal significance of our decisions. Picture Lucy waking the next morning. She has a big essay due in her philosophy seminar on free will. She could sleep in, but a soft sense of duty and excitement tugs at her. The night's conversation replays in her mind. Does Shera call Milo the tailor from the fable? Was his ruined cloak destiny, or chance, or the product of some cosmic chain of causes? She thinks of Doctor, Ortega's dream on the boat. At that moment, Lucy rises, her choice clear. She moves to her desk, flips open her laptop and begins writing. Is she determined to do so by her prior brain states and environment? Possibly, but she experiences it as a decision, an affirmation of who she is becoming, a philosopher, a seeker, someone who dares to question the fabric of reality. Road. All of this is more than academic speculation. It touches each of our lives. When you set goals, make a promise, or reflect on past mistakes, you're grappling, often unconsciously, with questions of free will and responsibility. Do you beat yourself up for failing, or do you see the factors that contributed to that failure and learn compassion for yourself and others? Do you champion the notion that you can become whoever you want, or do you accept a certain level of inevitability in your life's path? No philosopher can give you a definitive resolution, but they can hand you a map to explore. Ultimately, free will might be less about discovering some hidden metaphysical switch in the brain, and more about how we integrate our understanding of causation, moral responsibility, and selfhood into a cohesive worldview. Some might remain content with a compatibilist stance. We are free when our actions flow from our character and reasoning, even if those are themselves determined. Others might stand with Cain and insist there must be something deeper about our ability to create ourselves. Still, others might find comfort or disquiet in the hard determinist stance that emphasizes compassion and dissolution of blame. Yet at the day's end, life goes on. We still make choices, small and large, shaping who we are and the societies we inhabit. In that sense, the free will debate isn't a mere intellectual exercise. It's a lens through which we continually reinterpret our existence. Do we have free will? Remains as alive today as it was when philosophers first scribbled their doubts on parchment scrolls. Perhaps we'll never find a final answer, but in the search itself we uncover layers of human nature, the complexity of our moral systems, and the brilliance of our capacity to wonder. Let this script be an invitation to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep balancing the forces that shape us with the remarkable feeling of autonomy we carry within. As Lucy steps out of the cafe, the early morning sunlight gleaming on the sidewalk, she chooses to face her day. Determinism, compatibilism, libertarian freedom, or whatever cosmic swirl of cause and effect might underlie it all. Because in philosophy as in life, the journey continues, and every step along the way is both a question and an answer in the ever-unfolding dialogue of what it means to be free.